Welcome to Black Stories. Today, we bring you a tale of transformation, accountability, and the fight for respect. In a high-end restaurant, a black woman faces blatant discrimination from a waitress who doesn't know that her son is the owner of the establishment. What happens next challenges the culture of an entire workplace and sets the stage for a much-needed change. Join us as we explore this powerful story of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos, because the truth deserves to be told. Linda Thompson stepped out of the cab and took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment to take in the sight before her. The restaurant stood tall and elegant, its grand glass doors reflecting the city's golden glow. Inside, warm lighting illuminated the upscale decor, where well-dressed patrons dined over exquisite meals. Tonight was a special occasion. She had been looking forward to this evening for weeks, a chance to celebrate her own milestone and, more importantly, to take pride in what her son, Daniel Carter, had built. Daniel had spent years working his way up in the restaurant industry, defying the odds and overcoming the challenges that came with being a black entrepreneur in a field often dominated by others. His restaurant, Carter's Fine Dining, had become a beacon of success, praised for its world-class cuisine, impeccable service, and an atmosphere that made every guest feel welcome. Linda had been a part of his journey every step of the way. She had watched him burn the midnight oil, perfecting recipes, training his staff, and ensuring every detail of his establishment met his exacting standards. Yet, despite his relentless dedication, he remained humble. He often preferred to stay in the background, blending in among his employees, ensuring things ran smoothly without drawing attention to himself. This was one of the few times Daniel had insisted that his mother visit the restaurant alone. He had told her he would join her later for dessert, but for now he wanted her to sit back, relax, and enjoy the experience as a guest, not as the mother of the owner. She smoothed down the fabric of her deep navy blue dress, feeling an air of elegance as she stepped toward the entrance. The doorman greeted her with a polite nod, pulling open the door as she entered. The ambience inside was exactly what she had expected. Soft jazz played in the background, the faint clinking of glasses mixed with hushed laughter from intimate conversations. The scent of freshly baked bread and expertly prepared dishes filled the air, making her stomach rumble in anticipation. She approached the hostess stand, where a young woman with a warm smile greeted her. "Good evening. Welcome to Carter's Fine Dining," the hostess said cheerfully. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Linda replied, her voice smooth with excitement. "It should be under Thompson, table for one, though my son will be joining me later." The hostess nodded as she scanned the reservation list. "Ah, yes. Right this way, ma'am." The interaction was polite, efficient, exactly what Linda expected in a restaurant of this caliber. She followed the hostess through the dining area, admiring the sleek mahogany tables, the carefully placed candlelight, and the subtle yet sophisticated decor that made Carter's one of the most sought-after restaurants in the city. The hostess led her to a beautifully set table near the large bay windows, where the city lights twinkled in the night. "This is perfect," Linda said, smiling as she took her seat. "If you need anything, your server will be right with you," the hostess assured her before departing. Linda settled in, glancing over the menu, though she already had a good idea of what she wanted. Daniel had once raved about the grilled salmon with lemon butter sauce, a house specialty, and tonight she intended to try it for herself. Minutes passed. Linda glanced around, expecting a server to approach at any moment. She noticed how attentive and engaged the waitstaff were at the surrounding tables. She watched as a young woman brought a bread basket to a couple, another server pouring wine for a group of business professionals. Yet, at her table, there was no movement. She waited a few more moments before shifting in her seat, feeling a flicker of confusion. The restaurant wasn't overwhelmingly busy. It was steady, but she had seen tables seated after her already being served their drinks. Still, she decided to be patient. A few more minutes ticked by before a server finally appeared. She was a woman in her mid-30s with a sharp, no-nonsense expression and a stiff posture. Unlike the other waitstaff who moved with grace and ease, she carried herself with a certain rigidness, as though she were doing the job out of obligation rather than passion. Without offering a greeting or a smile, the woman pulled out a notepad and asked flatly, "Water?" Linda blinked at the abruptness but maintained her warmth. "Yes, please." The waitress, her name tag read Melanie, nodded and walked away without another word. Linda exhaled slowly, brushing off the mild rudeness. Perhaps the woman was just having a bad day. A few minutes later, Melanie returned with a glass of water, setting it down with a noticeable thud, causing a few droplets to spill onto the tablecloth. Linda picked up her napkin, dabbing at the small spill before glancing up at the waitress. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Melanie didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her notepad again, tapping her pen impatiently. "You ready to order?" There was no warmth in her tone, no pleasantries, just cold efficiency. Linda, ever the composed woman, ignored the attitude and nodded. "I'd like to start with the house salad, and for my entree, I'll have the grilled salmon." Melanie jotted it down quickly. "Got it." And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked away without even asking if Linda wanted anything else. Linda sat there for a moment, processing the interaction. She was no stranger to these moments. Subtle slights, curt service, the way some people's tones and manners changed depending on who they were serving. She had hoped Carter's would be different. Shaking her head slightly, she decided not to jump to conclusions. Maybe Melanie treated everyone like this. Maybe this wasn't about her at all. Even so, something about the exchange left an uncomfortable feeling in her stomach. She took a sip of water and waited, watching as Melanie moved through the dining room. The waitress stopped at a nearby table, greeting a pair of white diners with a bright smile and an enthusiastic tone. Linda's grip tightened around her glass. The difference was unmistakable. Melanie laughed at something one of the guests said, her posture completely different from the cold indifference she had shown Linda just moments ago. Linda inhaled deeply, reminding herself why she was here. Tonight was meant to be special. She had come to celebrate, to support her son's hard work, not to let someone else's behavior dampen the evening. Still, a thought lingered in her mind when she couldn't quite shake. If this is how she's treating me, how many other customers has she done this to? She straightened in her seat, determined not to let it get to her. She would wait, enjoy her meal, and deal with whatever came next with the same dignity she always carried. After all, Daniel had built this place on the foundation of respect, fairness, and excellence. Surely, one rogue employee wouldn't tarnish that vision. Or so she thought. Because tonight, things were only getting started. Linda Thompson sat at her table, her fingers lightly drumming against the linen-covered surface. She kept her expression neutral, but inside, a quiet discomfort began to settle. She had been in the restaurant for nearly 20 minutes now, and though she had finally placed her order, the service she had received so far was far from what she expected from a restaurant of this caliber, especially one that her son, Daniel Carter, had built on the foundation of excellence and inclusivity. Her server, Melanie, had been cold and dismissive from the very start. Linda had seen it before, the difference in how people acted depending on who they were serving. The way some people's smiles came easily when dealing with certain customers, but disappeared when faced with others. She had hoped that Carter's fine dining was above that. Yet, as she watched Melanie flit between tables, effortlessly engaging with other guests, she couldn't ignore the stark contrast in behavior. At the table beside hers, a young white couple had just been seated. Within moments, Melanie was all smiles, her demeanor shifting entirely. "Good evening." Melanie greeted them warmly, her voice light and friendly. "How are you two doing tonight?" The woman smiled back. "We're great. We've heard amazing things about this place." "Oh, you're in for a treat," Melanie gushed. "Our specials tonight are absolutely divine. Can I start you off with some wine?" Linda observed, her stomach tightening. It wasn't just her imagination. The same waitress who had barely made eye contact with her was now chatting effortlessly, her energy completely different from the rigid, almost reluctant attitude she had displayed at Linda's table. Linda took a slow sip of water, choosing to observe rather than react. She had been raised to pick her battles. She knew that sometimes it was better to wait to watch, to allow people to reveal their true selves before making a move. But she also knew when she was being disrespected. As Melanie walked past her table without so much as a glance, Linda decided to test something. She lifted her hand slightly. "Excuse me." Melanie barely paused, not bothering to stop or even turn her head fully. "I'll be right back," she said quickly, her tone dismissive before continuing on her way. Linda's brow lifted slightly. She wasn't asking for much, just the same basic courtesy afforded to every other guest. A few moments later, another waiter approached a nearby table, carrying a small basket of warm, freshly baked bread. He placed it down with a polite smile, refilling the guests' water glasses before moving along. Linda glanced at her own table. No bread, no refilled water, no sign of Melanie. Her patience, which had remained steady throughout the evening, began to thin. Linda wasn't the kind of woman who immediately jumped to conclusions. She believed in fairness, in giving people the benefit of the doubt. But this wasn't just one isolated moment. She had been seated before the couple next to her, yet they already had drinks, appetizers, and attentive service, while she had been ignored and brushed off. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a choice. And Linda knew that choices like this, small acts of bias, subtle microaggressions, added up. She straightened in her chair and took another sip of water. She wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. Several minutes later, Melanie finally returned, this time with Linda's salad. The plate was set down with just a little too much force, the ceramic clinking loudly against the table. Linda exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. "Thank you," she said politely. Melanie didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her notepad. "You still good on water?" she asked in a tone that suggested she didn't actually care about the answer. Linda glanced at her half-empty glass before meeting Melanie's eyes. "I'd appreciate a refill." Melanie gave a short nod before turning away. No smile, no warmth, no effort. Linda watched as she walked off. The young couple at the next table called Melanie over, and once again she transformed, a friendly, engaging server eager to please. "Would you like more bread?" Melanie offered them, already placing another basket on their table. Linda took another deep breath. She was a paying customer, just like everyone else in this restaurant. So why was she being treated like an afterthought? She had never been one to play the victim, but she also refused to accept disrespect quietly. When Melanie returned, Linda decided to be direct. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. Melanie barely glanced at her. "Yeah." Linda clasped her hands together, keeping her voice calm but steady. "I've noticed that every other table has received bread, but mine hasn't. Is there a reason for that?" Melanie blinked as if caught off guard. "Oh," she said quickly, "I must have forgotten. I'll bring some out." Linda tilted her head slightly. "You didn't forget at the other tables." For the first time, Melanie's carefully constructed mask faltered. A flicker of something passed over her face, annoyance, perhaps even guilt, before she covered it up with indifference. "It was just a mistake," Melanie said with a small shrug. "I'll get it now." She turned and walked off before Linda could say anything else. Linda sighed, setting her fork down. It was a small moment, but small moments like this often pointed to a much bigger issue. She knew she wasn't imagining things. She had felt the shift in energy the moment she walked in, the way Melanie had sized her up, dismissed her, and chosen to treat her differently. She wasn't overreacting. She wasn't being sensitive. She was simply acknowledging reality. And if Melanie thought she could continue treating her like less than, she had another thing coming. Linda had spent her life teaching people how to demand the respect they deserved, and tonight would be no different. She straightened in her chair, waiting. She wouldn't cause a scene, but she also wouldn't be silent. Tonight, Melanie was going to learn a lesson she wouldn't forget. Linda Thompson sat at her table, her patience thinning by the minute. The air around her remained warm and inviting, filled with the gentle hum of conversation, the soft clinking of silverware against fine china, and the occasional burst of laughter from other tables. Yet, at her table, there was an unmistakable chill. Her server, Melanie, had all but disappeared since their last interaction. Linda had expected that after directly calling out the missing bread, Melanie would return promptly, at the very least, to correct her mistake. But as she watched the waitress move fluidly through the restaurant, attentively refilling drinks, delivering dishes, and chatting with other guests, it became clear that Melanie was in no rush to tend to her. The longer she waited, the harder it became to ignore the growing sense of disrespect. Other guests were receiving service without issue. She saw the same young couple from earlier now enjoying their entrees, Melanie stopping by their table every few minutes to check on them. She watched another waiter bring over a bottle of wine to a nearby table, offering the guests a warm smile and detailed recommendations. And then there was her table, completely neglected. Linda inhaled slowly, trying to push aside the gnawing frustration in her chest. She had taught herself, through years of experience, to handle these moments with grace and dignity. But even the most patient person had their limits. She checked the time on her phone. It had been nearly 30 minutes since her salad plate had been cleared, and there was no sign of her entree. That was enough. She set her napkin down and raised her hand, signaling for Melanie. The waitress hesitated before approaching, her expression already annoyed, as though Linda was bothering her simply by asking for what she was owed. "Yes," Melanie said, arms crossed. Linda remained composed, keeping her voice even. "It's been quite a while since my salad was cleared. Could you check on my entree, please?" Melanie let out an exaggerated sigh, shifting her weight onto one hip. "The kitchen's busy," she replied. "It'll be out when it's ready." Linda narrowed her eyes slightly. She had dined in enough fine establishments to know that grilled salmon didn't take 30 minutes to prepare. She tilted her head slightly. "I understand that the kitchen may be busy, but I've noticed that guests who arrived after me have already been served. Can you confirm that my order was placed?" For the briefest moment, a flicker of something crossed Melanie's face, something like panic, and that's when it hit Linda. Melanie had never submitted her order. She had dismissed Linda the moment she walked in, barely paying attention to her, and in doing so, she had completely ignored her meal request. Melanie covered up her momentary hesitation quickly, her smirk returning. "Well, maybe those guests ordered something simpler," she said, her voice thick with sarcasm. "Fish takes time, you know." Linda's expression didn't waver. "Yes, I do know," she said, her voice cool. "I also know it doesn't take this long." Melanie's jaw tightened. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll check." She spun on her heel and stalked off toward the kitchen, but not before Linda caught the roll of her eyes. Linda exhaled slowly, pressing down the irritation rising in her chest. This wasn't just bad service. This was deliberate. She could feel the weight of the moment settling on her, that all too familiar feeling of being dismissed, treated as if she were invisible. And the worst part, Melanie wasn't even trying to hide her disdain anymore. As Linda waited, she scanned the dining room once more. She noticed another server, one of the younger waiters, a man named James, eyeing her table from across the room. He had been working another section, but his gaze flickered toward her a few times, his brows furrowing slightly as if he were noticing the discrepancy in service. Linda held his gaze for a second before he quickly looked away, as if debating whether or not he should intervene. But before she could think much more about it, Melanie returned, still empty-handed. "Well," Linda prompted, keeping her voice measured. Melanie crossed her arms again, sighing dramatically. "Your food's still not ready." There was a mocking edge to her voice now, a silent challenge in the way she said it. Linda leaned forward slightly, holding Melanie's gaze. "And why do you suppose that is?" she asked. Melanie's smirk faltered for a split second before she shrugged. "Like I said, the kitchen's busy." Linda remained still, watching her carefully. "Or is it because you never put my order in?" Melanie's body tensed. "You hesitated when I asked if my meal was placed," Linda continued smoothly. "You made an excuse about the kitchen being backed up, yet you have no problem serving other guests who arrived after me." A few nearby diners had stopped their conversations now, their attention shifting toward the escalating tension at Linda's table. Melanie's posture grew defensive. "Are you accusing me of something?" Linda didn't blink. "I'm simply pointing out what's obvious." Melanie let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, come on. You're acting like I did something to you." Linda raised an eyebrow. "You mean besides neglecting my table, delaying my meal, and treating me with blatant disrespect?" Melanie's face flushed red, though whether it was from embarrassment or frustration was unclear. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, shaking her head. "I'll go check again." But Linda had already had enough. "I think I'd rather speak to a manager," she said, her voice calm yet firm. Melanie froze. The confidence she had carried earlier seemed to crack slightly, her eyes widening just enough for Linda to catch it. "Seriously?" Melanie scoffed. "Over what? Slow service?" Linda tilted her head slightly, studying her. "No," she replied smoothly. "Over deliberate service, over choices that you've made. Over the way you've treated me compared to every other guest in this restaurant." For the first time, Melanie didn't have a comeback. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, and in that silence, Linda knew she had won. She reached for her purse, sitting up a little straighter. "You can either call your manager," she said, her voice still unwavering, still poised, "or I will." Melanie's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. It was in that moment that she realized she had underestimated Linda. And though she didn't know it yet, she had also just made the biggest mistake of her career, because what happened next would change everything. Linda Thompson sat quietly at her table, her eyes fixed on the empty plate in front of her. The elegant ambience of Carter's fine dining continued around her, soft jazz playing in the background, the clinking of silverware, and the muted hum of conversations at nearby tables. But for Linda, it all felt distant, as if the world had somehow shifted just slightly out of focus. The weight had grown unbearable. It had been over an hour since Linda's salad plate had been cleared, and there was still no sign of her main course. Her appetite had dwindled, replaced by a simmering frustration that had started to turn into something more. She had been patient, giving Melanie the benefit of the doubt, but at this point, she knew the truth. She was being treated differently. The restaurant was far from busy. Guests who had arrived well after her were already digging into their meals, while she sat, still waiting. The more Linda observed, the more it became clear that she was being purposefully ignored. She wasn't just being neglected, she was being dismissed. Her gaze wandered over to the couple who had been seated after her. They were laughing, the wine flowing freely, their server checking in regularly. The difference in the service they were receiving compared to her own was striking, and it stung. Melanie had walked past her table at least 3 times since Linda had asked for her order to be checked. Each time, she had barely glanced at Linda, much less offered an apology or an explanation for the delay. Linda could feel the heat rising inside her. She had tried to be understanding. She had tried to give Melanie the benefit of the doubt, but it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the obvious. This wasn't an innocent mistake or a matter of being too busy. It was deliberate disregard. Linda's patience had its limits. And now, sitting alone, ignored and belittled, she realized it was time to act. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Linda decided it was time to make her stand. She straightened in her chair, carefully adjusting her dress as if preparing for something important. This was it. She wasn't going to sit idly by any longer. She raised her hand once more, this time with more purpose than before. She would no longer tolerate being treated this way. After what seemed like an eternity, Melanie appeared, walking past Linda's table without so much as a glance. Linda cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm. Melanie stopped but didn't turn around. Her body language spoke volumes. She was irritated, unwilling to engage. "I've been waiting for over an hour," Linda said, keeping her tone even. "Would you be able to check on my order now?" Melanie turned to face her, crossing her arms over her chest. The smirk on her face was gone, replaced by a look of annoyance. "The kitchen's busy," she said with a dismissive shrug. "It'll come when it's ready." Linda's jaw clenched. She knew that excuse well enough. "I've been watching," Linda said, her voice becoming sharper. "Other tables that arrived after me have already been served." Melanie's lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing. She opened her mouth to respond, but Linda didn't wait for her. "I'm sorry, but I don't think this is about a busy kitchen," Linda continued, her words slow and deliberate. "I think you've been avoiding me on purpose." Melanie blinked, the words seeming to hit harder than Linda had expected. For the briefest moment, Linda saw something like uncertainty flash across the waitress's face, but it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "Look," Melanie snapped, "I'm just doing my job. If you want to make a big deal out of this, go ahead. But I don't have time for this." The words hit Linda like a slap. "I'm not trying to make a big deal out of anything," Linda said, her voice steady. "But I demand the same level of service as everyone else in this restaurant, and so far you've shown me none of that." Melanie took a step back, her eyes flashing. She clenched her jaw. "You're acting like I'm doing this on purpose," she muttered. "Maybe you're just being too sensitive." Linda stood up from her chair slowly, not taking her eyes off Melanie. "Maybe I'm not being sensitive enough. Maybe you've been treating me like I don't belong here. Maybe for you, that's normal." The tension in the air was palpable now. Diners around them began to take notice of the conversation, their curious glances flicking between Linda and Melanie. But neither woman was looking around. The confrontation had become too personal. Melanie's voice was laced with a sneer. "I don't have time for your drama. If you don't like the service, maybe you should go somewhere else." The insult hung in the air. Linda took a deep breath. The world around her was growing quieter, but her focus was razor sharp. "I don't think you understand," Linda said, her voice ice cold. "I am not the problem here. I've been patient, polite, and respectful. You have treated me like I am invisible, and I won't accept that. Not here, and certainly not anywhere else." Melanie looked at her, her lips curling into an expression of disbelief. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Linda stood firm, her posture straight. "I want to speak to the manager," she said, her words calm but carrying the weight of finality. Melanie's expression faltered for a moment before she sighed dramatically. "Fine. I'll go get the manager. Happy now." She turned on her heel and walked off without another word. Linda exhaled, the tension in her body slowly easing as she returned to her seat. She stared at the table, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She had always prided herself on being calm under pressure, stoic even in the face of adversity. But today, for the first time in a long while, she had let her emotions out in the open. It wasn't about being confrontational. It was about being seen. It was about refusing to accept a reality where she wasn't valued. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching her table. Melanie returned, her face flushed with irritation. Behind her stood Daniel Carter, her son, his tall figure and confident gait immediately recognizable even at a distance. Linda's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if it was out of relief or because she had known all along that Daniel was the key to everything. He was the one who would make sure this was handled properly. Melanie stopped at the edge of the table and gestured toward Linda. "This is the customer," she muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. Daniel's eyes flicked from Melanie to Linda. He didn't need to ask for an explanation. His gaze softened, and Linda could see the flicker of both disappointment and resolve in his eyes. He had always been someone who held others to the highest standards. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice quiet but filled with authority. "What happened?" Linda exhaled, taking a deep breath before responding. "This has nothing to do with the meal. It has everything to do with how I've been treated here tonight." She glanced at Melanie, who was still standing stiffly by the table. "And I'm not going to stand for it." Daniel's gaze shifted to Melanie, and for the first time that night, he didn't just see a server. He saw a woman who had crossed a line, and now he had to deal with it. "Melanie," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, "I think we need to have a conversation about your behavior tonight." Melanie stood frozen, her face a mixture of disbelief and resentment. Linda turned to face her son, knowing that this was the turning point. What came next would not only affect her evening but would set the tone for what would happen next, for Melanie and for the restaurant. Linda Thompson sat at her table, feeling the weight of the moment settling over her. The exchange with Melanie had left a sour taste in her mouth, but there was a sense of satisfaction, too. Finally, she had made it clear that she wouldn't stand by and let herself be mistreated. Still, the tension remained, thick in the air like a storm waiting to break. As Melanie walked off to fetch the manager, Linda couldn't help but reflect on the situation. It wasn't just the slow service or the unkind attitude. What stung most was the clear disregard for her presence, the subtle, yet undeniable racism that had been woven into the treatment. Linda had been on the receiving end of this kind of behavior before, subtle dismissals, the quiet undercurrent of prejudice that often reared its head when she least expected it. But in all those moments, she had always chosen to take the high road, to remain composed, to keep her dignity intact. Tonight, however, it had gone too far. She straightened her back, preparing herself for the conversation that was sure to follow. She knew Daniel would have to take action, but what could he possibly say to make it right? Could a simple apology undo the discomfort, the frustration, the hurt she had felt? The sound of footsteps broke her reverie. Melanie had returned, her face flushed, her body language rigid with annoyance. But there was something different this time. Behind her stood Daniel Carter. Linda's heart skipped a beat, but it wasn't out of surprise. It was out of an almost overwhelming sense of relief. She had known Daniel was managing the restaurant tonight, though she hadn't expected to see him until later. He was a man of principle, someone who took pride in ensuring that his establishment ran smoothly and treated everyone with respect. The realization hit Linda in that instant. Melanie had no idea who she was dealing with. Daniel stood tall and composed, his sharp eyes scanning the room. When he saw Linda sitting at the table, his expression softened for just a moment before his gaze shifted to Melanie, then back to his mother. Linda smiled faintly, knowing full well that this was the moment everything would change. Melanie was about to learn a hard lesson. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice low and calm, What happened here? Linda couldn't help but feel a wave of pride wash over her. Her son was always the one to stand up for what was right, and she knew he wouldn't let this slide. "It's not about the food, Daniel," Linda began, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "It's about the way I've been treated here tonight. The way Melanie has treated me." She turned slightly toward the waitress. "And I'm not just talking about poor service. I'm talking about disrespect. Disrespect that I didn't deserve." Daniel's gaze flicked over to Melanie, and Linda could see the anger building in his eyes. It was the kind of anger that wasn't rash or impulsive, but controlled, calculated, like he had already begun to piece together what had transpired. He turned back to Linda, nodding slowly. "I understand. Melanie, I think you and I need to talk." Melanie's eyes widened, her face paling slightly as Daniel addressed her directly. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to be called out for her actions, let alone face the consequences. Daniel's voice dropped, firm and deliberate. "Let's step into my office." Melanie hesitated for a moment, her defiance clashing with the reality of the situation. But as Daniel's gaze remained unyielding, she reluctantly nodded, her shoulders slumping. Linda watched as the two of them disappeared into the back office, her heart racing. This was the moment Melanie would realize what she had done. She had no idea that the woman she had so carelessly mistreated was not just another guest, but the mother of the owner. Linda sat quietly at her table, the hum of the restaurant around her becoming a blur. The realization of what had just happened, what was about to happen, was starting to settle in. She had always known that there was power in standing up for herself, but tonight was different. Tonight, the truth was about to come to light in front of everyone who had been silently observing the growing tension between Melanie and her. She had already spoken up, but she knew the consequences of this would be far-reaching. Not only would Melanie's treatment of Linda be called into question, but the very culture of the restaurant was about to be tested. Daniel had worked hard to create an environment where everyone felt welcomed, where no one was treated differently because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. Linda knew how hard he had fought to create that space, and now, that integrity was at risk. But she also knew Daniel would not let this stand. Across the room, Sarah, another server, had been quietly watching the interaction between Melanie and Linda. Sarah had always been one of the more observant employees, and Linda could tell she had seen enough. She caught Sarah's eye for a brief moment, and the unspoken understanding between them was clear. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a lesson for everyone involved. Linda was still lost in thought when the door to the office opened, and Daniel stepped out first, his expression composed but serious. Melanie followed closely behind, her head hanging slightly, eyes avoiding contact with anyone in the dining area. Daniel cleared his throat, the room going quiet almost instantly. He didn't need to say a word. The look in his eyes was enough to convey his disappointment. "Everyone," Daniel began, his voice carrying across the room, "I'd like to address something important." The staff fell silent, all eyes now on Daniel. Even the guests seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. "I'm sure you've all witnessed what happened here tonight," Daniel continued, his gaze sweeping over the room. "What I want to make clear is that disrespecting any guest, whether they're here for the first time or they're someone we've known for years, is unacceptable." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then his attention focused directly on Melanie. "Melanie," he said, his tone sharp, "this behavior cannot be tolerated in my restaurant." Melanie shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, her face flushing a deep shade of red. She had been so confident before, so sure that nothing could touch her, that she could get away with whatever she wanted. But now, under the weight of Daniel's words and the eyes of her coworkers, the reality of her actions was setting in. "I have been made aware that you have treated one of our guests, my mother, disrespectfully." Daniel continued. And let me be clear, no one in this restaurant is exempt from the expectations of respect and professionalism, not even you. Melanie opened her mouth to protest, but Daniel raised a hand, silencing her. No, he said firmly. I've already heard enough. You're relieved of your duties here tonight. The words hit Melanie like a physical blow. She stood frozen, unable to fully process what was happening. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was the end of her job. I'll give you a moment to gather your things, Daniel added. But let me be clear, this is about far more than a mistake. This is about how we treat people, and you have failed in that regard. As Melanie stood there, her shoulders slumped in defeat, Linda felt a sense of vindication. She had been right to call out the behavior. She had been right to demand accountability. But even more than that, she realized that tonight wasn't just about Melanie's actions. It was about ensuring that this kind of thing never happened again. Daniel's voice cut through the room once more. To everyone else, he said, his gaze sweeping over the staff, I hope this serves as a reminder of what we stand for here at Carter's. This is not just about food. It's about respect, integrity, and ensuring that every person who walks through our doors feels welcome. He paused, his expression hardening. If you can't support that, you don't belong here. The staff stood silently, absorbing the weight of his words. The tension in the room slowly dissipated, replaced by the sound of clinking silverware and hushed conversations. But something had shifted in the air. Something had changed. As Melanie gathered her things, Linda felt a quiet sense of satisfaction settle over her. Tonight, she had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And she knew that, in doing so, she had helped change something bigger. The air in Carter's fine dining had shifted, and Linda Thompson could feel the weight of it in every corner of the room. What had started as an uncomfortable dining experience had now evolved into something far more significant. As Daniel Carter stepped out of the office, his face set with determination, Melanie's face flushed a deep crimson. The realization of her actions, and the consequences they brought, was finally sinking in. Linda sat quietly at the table, watching the scene unfold. She had never been one to seek attention, but she had made a point tonight to ensure that her voice was heard. And now, the moment she had been waiting for, the inevitable moment of accountability, had arrived. Daniel turned to the rest of the staff, his voice steady but firm. Everyone, I'm sure you've witnessed what happened here tonight. He paused for a beat, scanning the room, making sure every person was paying attention. I want to be clear about one thing: this kind of behavior, this lack of respect for our guests, will not be tolerated in this restaurant. He spoke with the kind of authority that made it clear this wasn't a matter of opinion. It was a rule, one that everyone was expected to follow without exception. Linda could see the impact of Daniel's words as the staff began to shift uncomfortably. Some of them, like Sarah, the waitress who had witnessed the entire ordeal, had a look of understanding on their faces. Others looked more unsure, perhaps even frightened of the changes that might come next. Melanie, standing off to the side, had become a ghost in the room, barely making eye contact with anyone. Her previously confident posture had shriveled into something smaller, defeated. Daniel's gaze never wavered as he continued, his voice unwavering. We are a restaurant built on trust. Trust between the staff and our guests, and trust that every person who walks through those doors will be treated with dignity. He turned slowly to face Melanie, who was still standing near the door, her back to the wall. And Melanie, I'm afraid you've violated that trust. The room went silent. The only sound was the soft clink of silverware in the background and the faint hum of conversations from other diners. Linda could see the shift in energy. It wasn't just about Melanie anymore. It was about everyone in the restaurant and what kind of culture Daniel wanted to build. Melanie finally shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable under Daniel's steady gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her shoulders sagged slightly as she glanced at Linda, then back at Daniel. "Is there something you'd like to say?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but laced with authority. Melanie's eyes flitted around the room, searching for something, perhaps for support, perhaps for an out, before finally speaking, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just frustrated." She looked back at Linda. "It's not like I was trying to hurt anyone." Linda watched her closely, noting how Melanie's words lacked conviction. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry she had been caught. "Frustration doesn't excuse bad behavior," Daniel replied coldly, "especially when it comes at the cost of someone else's dignity." He turned back to the staff, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This is a matter of respect. If you can't provide that, you can't work here." Melanie bit her lip, her eyes welling up with tears. She opened her mouth again as though to protest, but Daniel held up a hand, silencing her. "Let's make this simple," he said. "I'm sorry, but your time here has come to an end. You're dismissed." The room seemed to hold its breath as Melanie stood there, frozen. It wasn't just the words that stung, it was the finality with which Daniel had said them. There was no room for negotiation, no second chances. Melanie had crossed a line, and now she had to face the consequences. Linda watched the scene unfold, the reality of Melanie's actions hitting home. There had been so many little moments leading up to this, each one of them small enough to ignore, easy enough to brush off. But they had built into something bigger, and now the system was correcting itself. The right thing was being done, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Melanie seemed to snap out of her daze when Daniel gestured toward the back exit. She took a step forward, her movements slow and uncertain. I need to get my things," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel didn't respond, merely watching her retreat with a gaze that seemed to cut through the air between them. Melanie turned and walked toward the staff room, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The silence that followed felt thick, almost suffocating. Linda could feel the eyes of the other staff members on her, some with pity, others with uncertainty about what would happen next, but none of them dared to speak. Daniel turned toward Linda, his expression softening as he finally addressed her directly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said, his voice full of empathy. "That's not the kind of experience I want our guests to have." Linda smiled faintly, her heart still heavy from the evening's events. "I appreciate you handling it, Daniel, but it's not just about me. It's about the standard you set here. You've worked too hard to build this place to let something like this slide." He nodded, his face serious. "I couldn't agree more." Linda reached for her glass of water and took a long sip. The cool liquid felt refreshing, but it didn't take away the nagging feeling in her stomach. She had spoken up, she had demanded respect, but she couldn't shake the thought that there were other guests out there who hadn't been as lucky as she had. She wasn't just thinking of the ones who had walked out in frustration after being ignored. She was thinking of all the times people like her, people of color, were made to feel like they didn't belong in spaces like this, spaces that were supposed to be welcoming. She turned to Daniel, her voice steady. "You did the right thing tonight, but don't forget, this is just one instance. The real work begins now." Daniel's eyes locked with hers, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I know, Mom. I won't forget." Minutes later, Melanie returned to collect her belongings, her head bowed low. Linda watched as she walked past her, the weight of the situation heavy on the young woman's shoulders. Melanie didn't make eye contact as she passed, but Linda couldn't help but feel a flicker of something human in the exchange. Perhaps it was guilt or shame, or maybe a mix of both. Either way, it was clear that Melanie was learning a painful lesson, one that would follow her far beyond this restaurant. Once she was gone, Linda turned back to Daniel, offering him a reassuring smile. "This is going to be a long road," she said softly, "but it's a start. You're building something important here." Daniel nodded, his expression resolute. "I've always known it's not going to be easy, but I also know that I won't back down from doing what's right. Tonight proves that." The restaurant's atmosphere had returned to a calm hum, but for Linda, the evening had become a reminder of just how much work there still was to do. She had seen the change start here tonight, but the larger fight for respect, for dignity, was far from over. She glanced around the restaurant, noticing the subtle shifts in the air. The staff would remember tonight. The question now was whether they would learn from it. The moment Daniel Carter dismissed Melanie from her shift, the air in Carter's fine dining seemed to shift dramatically. The previously warm, intimate atmosphere had turned into something charged. Everyone in the restaurant could feel it. The hush that fell over the room was a subtle but powerful acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just the end of a shift. It was the end of an era for Melanie at this restaurant. Linda Thompson sat at her table, her fingers lightly drumming the edge of her water glass, still processing everything that had transpired. Melanie's departure had been swift and direct, but the consequences of her actions were far from over. Linda could feel the weight of the moment, the tension in the room. It wasn't just about the treatment she had received, it was about the message that had been sent. Daniel stood at the front of the restaurant, his posture tall and commanding, his gaze focused on the staff members who had silently observed the entire situation. As Melanie left, he glanced back at Linda, offering a brief, reassuring smile. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Daniel said softly, his voice steady and full of empathy. "But this won't be swept under the rug. We need to address it now." Linda nodded, taking a slow breath. "You did the right thing, but now the real work begins." The staff had gathered in the break room. The few who had remained after the evening rush had all witnessed the fallout from Melanie's actions. The tension was palpable. Some of them were still processing what had happened, others were already starting to whisper. But one thing was certain, the culture at Carter's fine dining was going to change. Daniel stood in front of the staff, his gaze sweeping over them as he prepared to speak. It wasn't just the incident with Melanie that he had to address, but the broader issue of how respect was maintained in the restaurant, for both guests and fellow employees. As the last few waiters filtered into the room, Daniel took a deep breath and began. "I want to make something clear. What happened tonight wasn't just about poor service, it was about a violation of the values we hold here." He paused, letting the words sink in. Carter's fine dining was built on a foundation of inclusivity and respect. Tonight, those values were ignored, and that's something I can't overlook. We don't treat people like that, not here, not in this restaurant. A murmur of agreement rippled through the staff, but there was also discomfort in the room. Some of them were clearly uncomfortable, not with the message, but with the reality that they were now being asked to reflect on their roles in this larger issue. Sarah, a seasoned server who had worked at Carter's for over 3 years, cleared her throat. She had always been a quiet observer, rarely making waves, but tonight she couldn't remain silent. "I've worked here for a while and I've always admired the atmosphere we've built, but I'm not going to pretend like I didn't notice what happened. Melanie wasn't the only one who ignored Linda." Daniel's eyes flickered toward Sarah, and she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the next words. "I've seen it before, not just with Linda, but with other customers too. People get treated differently and it's not always obvious, but it's there." The room went still. Sarah's words cut through the air with quiet conviction, and Daniel could see the truth in them. There were unspoken biases, microaggressions, and judgments that had slipped through the cracks, unnoticed by some but felt deeply by others. "Thank you, Sarah," Daniel said, his voice softer now. "That's exactly what we need to address." We've built a brand here that values everyone, but we need to make sure that our actions align with that. No one should feel like they don't belong here, ever." A young server named Mark, who had been with Carter's for just a few months, spoke up hesitantly. "I didn't know what was going on earlier tonight. I saw Linda asking for the manager, but I didn't really understand why she was so upset. Now I get it. But how do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Daniel nodded, acknowledging Mark's question. "It starts with accountability. Each of us has a responsibility to ensure that our actions are aligned with the values of this restaurant. That means checking ourselves, calling out behavior when we see it, and making sure everyone is treated equally." The staff members exchanged looks, some of them nodding slowly, others unsure of what exactly to do next. The weight of Daniel's words lingered in the air, but now they were at a crossroads. They could either choose to continue as they had been, allowing the subtle biases to fester, or they could choose to make a change. Linda remained at her table, her mind still processing the evening. She had demanded respect, and she had gotten it, but she couldn't ignore the fact that this incident wasn't an isolated one. There were patterns of behavior here, patterns that went unnoticed or, perhaps, were simply ignored. Her thoughts were interrupted when Daniel approached her, his face set in a firm, determined expression. "I want to thank you again for your patience tonight," he said, his tone genuine. "What happened wasn't easy, but you were right to stand your ground. I'm proud of you." Linda smiled, but her smile was tinged with something more complex. "I didn't do it for myself, Daniel. I did it because it shouldn't happen to anyone." Daniel's face softened and he pulled up a chair, sitting across from his mother. "I know, and I appreciate it. But now that this is out in the open, we need to address it more broadly. This isn't just about Melanie. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels like they belong here. We've come a long way, but there's still work to be done." Linda nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "The work never stops, does it?" Daniel shook his head. "No, it doesn't, but this is where we start. I want to be transparent with my staff. They need to understand that this kind of behavior, whether it's directed at a customer or a colleague, cannot stand." Linda smiled again, her pride for her son swelling in her chest. "Then you're on the right path." Back in the staff room, Daniel continued the conversation, now focused on what concrete steps they would take to ensure that this kind of behavior was eradicated from Carter's fine dining. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of each staff member. "We're going to hold a training session on unconscious bias. It's important that we not only recognize the microaggressions that happen daily, but also acknowledge the systems that allow them to persist." The staff members listened intently, some taking notes, others simply absorbing what was being said. The commitment in Daniel's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just about fixing an individual mistake. It was about transforming the culture of the entire restaurant. "We'll also be implementing a new feedback system, where every employee has the opportunity to share their thoughts and concerns anonymously," Daniel continued. "That way, we can address any issues before they escalate. This is about creating a safe space for everyone who walks through these doors, staff and customers alike." There was a brief moment of silence, and then, one by one, the staff members began to speak. Some were relieved to hear that changes would be made. Others were concerned about what the training might uncover, but all of them were on the same page. They wanted to make this work. Daniel concluded the meeting with a simple but powerful statement. "We can't change everything overnight, but we can start making a difference today. It starts with us." As the staff dispersed, Linda sat quietly at her table, reflecting on the conversation that had just unfolded. The ripple effects of that one interaction, the confrontation with Melanie, were still reverberating throughout the restaurant. And while it had been a difficult night, Linda knew that it had sparked something important. It had forced them all to confront the hard truths about their behavior and to take responsibility for the culture they were creating. Daniel approached her once more, his face softened by the weight of the conversation. "I'm glad you're still here. I've got a lot of work ahead of me, but I think we're headed in the right direction." Linda smiled, her heart full. "You've always known what's right. It's just a matter of making sure everyone else sees it, too." The air in Carter's fine dining was thick with the remnants of tension, but as the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to shift again. Daniel Carter, the owner of the establishment, had made his decision. He had taken swift action against Melanie, the waitress who had mistreated his mother, Linda, and his actions were a testament to the standards he held for his business. But now the real work had begun, ensuring that the actions of one employee didn't become a reflection of a deeper issue within his restaurant. Linda had been quietly reflecting on the evening's events when Daniel approached her table. There was something more in his eyes than just the usual professional resolve. There was an undercurrent of resolve and commitment to make things right, not just for her, but for the entire establishment. "We've got some work ahead of us, but I think you'll be pleased with the direction we're taking," Daniel said, sliding into the seat across from Linda. The room had quieted significantly after the staff meeting, and most of the remaining diners had finished their meals. It was a rare moment of calm, one that Linda appreciated. "I'm proud of how you handled everything tonight," she said with a warm smile. "But this isn't just about Melanie. This is about ensuring this doesn't happen again, not just here but anywhere." Daniel nodded. "I know. That's why this isn't over yet. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the staff understands what happened here and why it won't be tolerated. I'll be holding another meeting first thing tomorrow. We'll discuss training, accountability, and what happens when people make excuses instead of taking responsibility." Linda's eyes softened as she looked at her son. She knew better than anyone the amount of hard work Daniel had put into building Carter's fine dining. She could see the way he cared for his employees and the customers who walked through the doors. He had built a place where people felt welcome, no matter their background. But even he, with all his dedication, was learning that sometimes it wasn't just about providing excellent food and service. It was about challenging the ingrained biases that could fester within even the most well-intentioned places. "I think it's time for people to start really looking at their behavior, Daniel. It's not just the obvious slights. It's those small, subtle moments that, when left unchecked, turn into something much bigger." Daniel's gaze remained steady as he absorbed his mother's words. "Exactly, and that's the hardest part. We've got to tackle those moments head on, and we'll start with accountability. No more excuses." The next day, Daniel stood at the front of the staff room, the same group of employees who had gathered the previous night now facing him with a mix of curiosity and unease. Some of them still seemed uncertain about the changes that were coming. Others, like Sarah, appeared more resolved. It was clear that the restaurant's dynamic was about to shift, whether they were ready for it or not. "Good morning, everyone," Daniel said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Thank you for coming in early today. I know this isn't easy, but it's necessary. We're here to talk about last night's events and what's going to happen moving forward." He paused, making eye contact with several staff members. His gaze rested briefly on Melanie's former section, where Sarah now stood. Linda's words from the previous evening rang in his mind. Small moments left unchecked could create big problems down the road. Daniel had no intention of letting this issue fester any longer. "I want to start by saying this," Daniel continued. "What happened last night with Melanie wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that we all need to address. What happened here last night was an example of how excuses can turn into unaccountable actions." He let the words sink in before continuing, his voice growing stronger. "And that's not something I'll stand for, not in my restaurant, not under any circumstances." A few of the staff members shifted uncomfortably. Sarah, who had spoken up the night before, gave Daniel an encouraging nod. She had seen the behavior he was talking about in the past, and she knew he was right. The problem was often so subtle that it was easy to ignore, but that didn't mean it should go unchecked. "This is the part where we need to get real," Daniel said. "I've had enough of the excuses. I was frustrated. I was having a bad day. The kitchen's busy. These are just excuses. They don't change the fact that people are being hurt by actions that go unchecked. We can't keep allowing that to happen. So, moving forward, we're going to have to take accountability for everything we do." Daniel's words hit home for several of the staff. One server, Jessica, raised her hand, and Daniel gestured for her to speak. "I get that we all have bad days," Jessica said cautiously. "But I also get that the restaurant isn't the place to take it out on others. I know we've all had moments of frustration, but sometimes we don't realize how those moments can affect others." Daniel nodded. "Exactly. This is about being aware of our actions. The way we treat each other, the way we treat our customers, it all matters. And we need to be honest with ourselves about that. Excuses won't cut it anymore." He turned to face the rest of the group, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Each of you is part of this team. That means you have to take responsibility for your actions, whether they're big or small. It's not enough to show up and do the bare minimum. We are responsible for creating a safe, welcoming environment for everyone, guests and staff alike." Daniel paused for a moment to let the weight of his words sink in. "And if anyone isn't prepared to live up to those standards, then they don't belong here. No one gets to hide behind excuses." After the meeting, the staff remained silent for a few moments, processing what Daniel had said. This wasn't just about providing good service anymore. This was about something deeper, something that went beyond customer service and the typical pressures of the restaurant business. This was about creating a culture of accountability, where people felt safe to speak up and where bad behavior wasn't allowed to slide. Sarah approached Daniel after the meeting, her face thoughtful. "I know this isn't going to be easy," she said, "but it's needed. Melanie wasn't just acting out of frustration. She made a choice. And that's the part that's hardest for me to swallow." Daniel nodded. "I hear you, Sarah. And that's why we need to act now. We can't let these behaviors go unchecked, and we can't afford to let people keep making excuses for why they treat others poorly. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. If we can't do that here, we can't be a successful team." Linda, who had been observing from the back of the room, approached her son with a soft smile. "I'm proud of you, Daniel. This is the kind of leadership this restaurant needs. But don't stop here. Keep calling out the excuses and keep making people face the truth of their actions." Daniel looked at her, a quiet determination in his eyes. "I won't stop, not until things change for the better." Linda placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a rare moment of reassurance. "I know you won't. You've always known what's right. Just keep doing the right thing." As the staff filtered out of the room, Daniel felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. The restaurant wasn't just about serving food. It was about setting the standard for how people should treat each other, for holding each other accountable, and for demanding respect in every interaction. Daniel had drawn a line in the sand, and now he was prepared to follow through, no matter the cost. The excuses were over. It was time to hold everyone, including himself, accountable. The sun had barely begun to set, casting a golden glow over the restaurant's exterior. But inside, the atmosphere at Carter's Fine Dining was anything but calm. After the dramatic events of the previous evening, the staff had been left to process what had occurred. The night had been marked not just by Melanie's behavior, but also by the bold steps Daniel had taken to ensure accountability. And while the decision to fire Melanie had been swift, Daniel knew that the repercussions of her actions were far from over. The challenge was now in making sure the message was not just heard, but understood. Linda sat at the same table she had been seated at the night before. This time, She was watching the restaurant come back to life with a sense of anticipation. The waitstaff moved more deliberately today, their posture a little straighter, their eyes more attuned to the guests they served. But the unease still lingered. Daniel's words from yesterday still echoed in the air. No one could pretend it hadn't happened. But the real test of what would happen next was about to unfold. Linda sipped her water slowly, observing the ebb and flow of the restaurant. She couldn't shake the feeling that today would be a pivotal moment in not just her son's business, but also in the kind of workplace he wanted to cultivate. She had always known Daniel had the potential to change things in ways others wouldn't. His commitment to his values had shaped his restaurant, but now he was putting those values to the test. At the back of the restaurant, Daniel stood with Sarah, who was preparing for the evening rush. She had proven herself to be reliable and honest, and Daniel had come to trust her perspective over the years. They had just wrapped up another training session on unconscious bias, accountability, and the importance of creating a welcoming environment. The room had been full of nervous tension, but Daniel knew it had been necessary. "I don't think anyone was really expecting this to happen, Daniel," Sarah said, pulling her apron tight around her waist. She glanced over her shoulder to check the time, then looked back at him. "But I think everyone understands now. No one wants to be caught off guard like that again." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "Good. They need to understand that it wasn't just about one bad night, it's about the culture we're building here. The way we treat people every day, every interaction matters, and no one gets to make excuses for failing at that." Sarah paused for a moment, her brow furrowed as she thought. "But Melanie, Daniel, she's been here a long time. She's always been difficult to manage, you know that." "I know," Daniel said, exhaling deeply. "But the truth is, we can't ignore things like this anymore. And I have to be willing to do what's right, even if it means losing someone who's been here for a while. It's bigger than any one employee." Sarah's eyes met Daniel's, a flicker of something, perhaps relief, perhaps uncertainty, shining through. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "You're right. You're absolutely right. It's just hard to think about it all coming to this. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable or that they don't belong here," Daniel said, his voice steady. "We can't afford to compromise on that, Sarah. Not now, not ever." As the evening rush approached, the quiet anticipation in the restaurant grew louder. The staff moved quickly, setting tables, adjusting glasses, and preparing for another busy night of service. But it was hard to ignore the undercurrent of tension that seemed to vibrate through the space. Tonight wasn't just another night of business as usual. It was a turning point for Carter's fine dining. Melanie had not shown up for her shift. She had already been informed of her dismissal, but her absence left a strange feeling hanging in the air, one that was a combination of relief and uncertainty. The decision had been made, but Daniel couldn't help but wonder if he had handled it in the best way possible. Had he done enough? Was firing Melanie the only solution, or could he have done more? He knew he couldn't go back, but there was still a part of him that was questioning the long-term impact of this decision. Would it really lead to the culture shift he hoped for, or would it just be another empty gesture? The first table of the evening was seated, a couple on a date, excited to try Carter's signature dishes. Their energy was contagious, and Daniel smiled as he watched them being greeted with warmth by the staff. It was moments like this that reminded him of why he had gotten into the business in the first place, to create a space where everyone felt at home. But as the evening continued, the weight of the past 24 hours continued to press on him. He checked the time, his mind still racing. He had given everyone the tools to make the right decisions, but how would they respond when no one was watching? How would they act when there were no immediate consequences? That's when his phone buzzed on the counter next to him. He checked the message and his heart skipped a beat as he read the words. It was from Sarah, and it was short but packed with meaning. "Melanie's here." Daniel's stomach turned as he made his way toward the back of the restaurant. His mind raced, wondering if Melanie had come to confront him about her dismissal, or if she was there to apologize. Maybe she was seeking redemption, maybe trying to explain herself. Whatever it was, Daniel knew that now was the time for the final confrontation. He walked through the back door and into the hallway that led to the staff room. As he entered, he saw Melanie standing near the lockers, her shoulders slumped. Her uniform was still neatly pressed, but there was an air of uncertainty around her. It was as if she had walked into the room expecting something but hadn't prepared for the reality of what was happening. "Melanie," Daniel said, his voice steady but not unkind. "What are you doing here?" Melanie lifted her head slowly, avoiding his eyes for a moment before meeting his gaze. She opened her mouth to speak but paused. She started, her voice weak. She took a deep breath. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have acted like that. I didn't mean to disrespect anyone." Daniel stood still, his eyes studying her, trying to gauge if she truly understood the depth of her actions. "I've heard that before, Melanie. I've heard the excuses. You were frustrated, you were having a bad day, but the truth is your actions weren't just about frustration. They were a choice, and that choice was to disrespect my mother." Melanie looked down, her face flushed with shame. "I know," she whispered. "I was wrong. I don't know what came over me." Daniel shook his head. "That's the problem. You don't get to just not know. If you want to be a part of this team, you have to take responsibility for your actions. Every single time." There was a long pause, the silence in the room heavy between them. Finally, Melanie spoke again, her voice barely audible. "I get it. I do. I just didn't realize what I was doing, I thought. Maybe I thought it wouldn't matter, but it does. And I've learned that the hard way." Daniel's expression softened just a fraction, but he knew the decision had already been made. There was no room for people who couldn't take accountability for their behavior. "I'm not sure what you want from me now, Melanie," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "But it's clear to me that you weren't ready to be a part of this team. I'm afraid that your time here is done." Melanie's face fell. She opened her mouth to protest, but she knew it was too late. The decision had been made and there was no going back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Daniel nodded once, a quiet understanding between them. "I hope you learn from this, and I hope you find a place where you can be the kind of person you want to be, but it won't be here." As Melanie turned to leave, Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the decision. The restaurant had been his dream, and tonight, that dream had been tested. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he did know this. The culture of Carter's fine dining would be defined by accountability, and no one, no matter how long they had worked there, was above it. Linda, still sitting at the table, watched as Daniel re-entered the dining area. She could see the look of determination on his face, the same resolve she had seen in him since he was a child. It wasn't about winning. It was about doing what was right, no matter how difficult it was. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Daniel nodded, a small smile on his face. "Yeah, Mom, everything's going to be just fine." The evening was winding down at Carter's fine dining, but the tension from earlier in the day still lingered. The events of the past 24 hours had created a shift, one that wasn't just confined to the small group of employees involved. It had rippled through the entire restaurant. The word was out. Melanie had been let go. The staff had been forced to confront not only her behavior but also their own. And for Daniel Carter, the owner, it had been the first step in making sure the restaurant he had worked so hard to build would be a place that reflected his values. But today was about more than just one bad experience or one difficult decision. It was about creating a culture, a foundation of accountability and respect that would define Carter's fine dining moving forward. The actions that had been taken were not just about correcting a mistake, they were about setting a precedent. The next morning, the staff gathered once again for a mandatory meeting. The room was quiet, the usual banter replaced by an uneasy silence. Some of the staff had never been in a meeting like this before. They were accustomed to running through training or staff updates, but this was different. This wasn't about new procedures or special offers. It was about the very culture of the restaurant. Daniel stood at the front of the room, his posture straight and his voice calm, but there was an unmistakable intensity in his eyes. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I've called you here this morning," he began. "Yesterday, a decision was made that affected all of us. Melanie is no longer part of this team, and while the immediate cause of her dismissal was her treatment of a guest, my mother, there's a bigger lesson here for all of us." He paused, making sure the room was fully engaged. The staff members exchanged glances, some of them shifting in their seats, others staring down at their hands or the floor. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it," Daniel continued. "What happened with Melanie wasn't an isolated event. We've all seen small moments like that, disrespectful comments, thoughtless actions. Sometimes we don't even realize it when it's happening. We brush it off or ignore it, but that stops now." Daniel's voice grew firmer, his eyes sweeping across the room. "We can no longer afford to ignore the way we treat others. We are accountable for our actions, and that accountability starts with each of you and me." The room was silent, and Daniel could see that the weight of his words was sinking in. No one had expected this kind of meeting, and certainly no one had expected the kind of change that was now unfolding. Sarah, the experienced server who had spoken up the previous day, was one of the first to respond. She stood, her voice steady but full of conviction. "I think we all know that this place is built on respect, but sometimes we forget that it's not just about being polite or following the rules. It's about genuinely caring for the people we serve. And that includes our guests, our coworkers, and everyone who walks through these doors." Daniel nodded in agreement. "Exactly. And that's why we need to be honest with ourselves. It's time to stop making excuses for bad behavior and start looking at what we're contributing to the environment here. We don't get to hide behind frustration or stress. We don't get to treat people poorly because it's easier or because we don't feel like doing the right thing." The staff was starting to understand. The conversation that had begun as a confrontation had evolved into something far more powerful, a moment of accountability for everyone, not just Melanie. It was clear that change wasn't going to be something that could be dictated from the top down. It had to be a shared responsibility. Everyone had to participate. As the meeting continued, Daniel outlined new protocols and expectations for the staff. There would be regular training on inclusivity, unconscious bias, and the importance of creating a welcoming environment. But it wasn't just about training. It was about creating a culture where accountability wasn't something you had to think about. It was something that was ingrained in the way you operated every day. He emphasized that anyone who witnessed disrespectful behavior had an obligation to speak up. The silence was no longer an option. Everyone was responsible for making sure that no one walked away from Carter's feeling less than. The restaurant was a place where everyone was meant to feel valued. And if that couldn't be guaranteed, then they were failing at their job. Linda, who had quietly observed the meeting from the side, couldn't help but feel proud of her son. She had always known that Daniel was capable of great things, but today, she saw the depth of his commitment to building something that wasn't just profitable but meaningful. "Each of you plays a role in this," Daniel said, looking each staff member in the eye. "Whether you're taking an order, serving a drink, or cleaning a table, you're shaping the experience for every guest. And that experience has to reflect who we are as a restaurant and as people. We won't tolerate anything less." There was a shift in the room. The nervousness that had lingered earlier had transformed into a palpable sense of unity. The staff understood the message. It wasn't just about not making mistakes. It was about actively doing better every day, making sure the environment was always one of respect and care. "I want you all to think about what we stand for here," Daniel continued. This restaurant is a reflection of the values we share. If we fail to uphold those values, we're failing not only our customers but each other. We need to be honest with ourselves, and if we don't think we're upholding the standards, we need to correct it. After the meeting ended, the restaurant began to hum with life again. The dinner rush had started, and the staff moved with a renewed sense of purpose. But it wasn't just business as usual. There was a new energy in the air, one that came from knowing that things were going to change. Sarah had always been one of the quieter staff members, but after the meeting, she found herself taking on a more active role in ensuring the new expectations were met. She noticed when a fellow server, Mark, began speaking in a tone that could be construed as dismissive to a customer, and she made sure to step in and correct him. Not out of judgment, but out of the desire to help him align with the new standards they were working to set. In the kitchen, the cook spoke more openly with the waitstaff, making sure that everyone was on the same page about meal prep times, table orders, and how the night was unfolding. There was a new level of collaboration that hadn't been as prevalent before. And as the night came to a close, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The restaurant had made it through the night, and it had been one of the most successful shifts they'd had in a long time. Not just in terms of sales, but in terms of the energy that filled the space. The staff was more aligned, more connected, and most importantly, they had taken ownership of the culture they were building. Linda, who had stayed for dinner, watched as Daniel interacted with his staff at the end of the night. She knew that this was just the beginning. What had happened with Melanie had opened a door, one that Daniel had walked through and in doing so had brought everyone along with him. As the restaurant emptied out for the night and the final guests left, Daniel and Linda sat together, sharing a quiet moment of reflection. The night had gone better than either of them had expected, and it was clear that the decisions made were already starting to bear fruit. "I'm proud of you, Daniel," Linda said softly, her voice full of pride. "You've handled this better than I ever could have imagined. You've created something here that isn't just about food or drinks, it's about people." Daniel smiled, a sense of humility in his eyes. "I've learned from the best, Mom, and I know we're just getting started. The real work is making sure this isn't a one-time thing. It has to be something that's part of who we are, every single day." Linda nodded, her smile widening. "I have no doubt you'll make it happen." And as the last of the staff filtered out of the restaurant, Daniel and Linda were left in the quiet of the evening, knowing that a real change had begun, not just in Carter's fine dining but in the hearts and minds of everyone who worked there. This was a new beginning, a lesson for everyone, indeed. The morning after the intense staff meeting felt different at Carter's fine dining. It wasn't just the soft sunlight filtering through the large windows or the gentle hum of the kitchen as preparations began for another day of service. There was a quiet shift in the atmosphere, an undercurrent of something deeper, something more meaningful. For the first time in a long time, the restaurant wasn't just about serving excellent food. It was about something far more significant, creating a culture that didn't just meet expectations but exceeded them. Linda sat at her usual table, her favorite seat by the window. She watched as the staff filtered in, each of them wearing an expression that was a little different from the usual busy energy she had witnessed in the past. There was a renewed sense of purpose among them, and Linda could feel it. It wasn't just that they were going through the motions of their jobs. It was that they were now mindful of their role in creating an environment of respect and inclusivity. Daniel had worked tirelessly to build Carter's, but now he was working even harder to make sure that his vision extended beyond the food and the service. It was about people, both those who walked through the door as guests and those who worked to make it happen behind the scenes. The previous day had been a turning point, and now, as the first customers began to trickle in, Daniel stood behind the bar looking out over the dining room. His thoughts were focused, but there was an undeniable sense of calm that had settled over him. The decision to let Melanie go had been the right one, but the truth of that decision wasn't just in her dismissal. It was in how he and his staff moved forward after that moment. He thought back to the meeting they'd held the day before. The energy had been heavy, but it had been necessary. Sarah's willingness to speak up, the staff's responses, the acknowledgement of what had gone wrong, those were the signs of change. The uncomfortable conversation about excuses versus accountability had laid the groundwork for something more profound than just disciplinary actions. It was a lesson in honesty and in self-awareness, but it wasn't over yet. Daniel knew that this was just the beginning of the work he needed to do. It was one thing to hold someone accountable, but it was another to maintain that level of accountability every single day. The changes had to come not just from the top down, but from the bottom up. Everyone had to own the shift that had taken place. Daniel was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. Sarah, always quick to check in and provide feedback, appeared with a clipboard in hand. "Hey, Daniel, got a moment?" Sarah asked, her voice low but steady. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking," Sarah began, looking around to make sure they weren't overheard, "about the new approach you've set up. It's a good start, but I think we need to go further. There's still a lot of resistance out there in some people, not just with Melanie. I've seen small comments from some of the staff that might be easy to overlook, but if we don't address them now, it could backfire later." Daniel raised an eyebrow, his attention fully on Sarah. "What kind of comments?" She hesitated, but her voice was sure when she spoke. "I've overheard some jokes, comments about certain guests, things like that. It's subtle, but it's there. And I'm worried that we're not really changing the environment if we just brush it aside." Daniel's face hardened slightly, but his voice was calm when he responded. "You're right. This isn't about stopping with Melanie. This is about creating sustainable change, and that's going to mean addressing the small things before they turn into something bigger." Sarah nodded, grateful for his response. "Exactly. It's not enough to just call people out when they make big mistakes. We need to cultivate a culture where microaggressions and small biases aren't tolerated either." Daniel let out a long breath, realizing just how much work there was left to do. "I'll schedule another meeting. We need to address this in a more structured way. It's not just about service, it's about respect. If we're going to stand by our values, we have to live them every day." Later that evening, the restaurant was busier than usual. The familiar chatter of guests filled the air, the clink of glasses creating a comforting rhythm in the background. But tonight, it wasn't just the dinner rush that caught Daniel's attention. It was the way his staff interacted with one another and with the guests. There was a noticeable change. Sarah had been right. People were starting to pay attention to their own behavior and to the behavior of those around them. It wasn't just the absence of the negative, but the presence of positive, intentional actions. The staff was greeting each other with respectful language, and even in the kitchen, where stress could often lead to tension, there was a sense of collaboration rather than frustration. But Daniel knew that there would be times when it would get difficult, times when it would be easier to let things slide. He couldn't afford to let that happen. Sustaining the change wasn't about setting expectations. It was about being vigilant, consistently reinforcing the message, and staying true to the core values. As the night went on, Daniel observed his team moving with a quiet confidence. There was a hum of energy in the air, a sense of focus and commitment. But it wasn't just about the job. It was about what they were creating together. Carter's wasn't just a place to work. It was a place where people were choosing to be better, to be more conscious of the impact their actions had on others. And that was something far greater than any menu item or wine pairing could ever offer. As the last of the guests were finishing their meals and the lights dimmed in the dining room, Daniel sat down for a moment to reflect. His staff had performed well, But he knew that the real test wouldn't come from how smoothly the service went tonight. It would come from the conversations that happened behind the scenes, the difficult moments when old habits threatened to resurface. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother, Linda. "I'm proud of you, Daniel. You've made this restaurant a place that stands for something more than just food. It's about people, and that's something you've always known." The words warmed him, but they also reminded him that he wasn't just working for himself. Carter's was a legacy, and it was about making sure that it would continue to serve others in the right way long after he was gone. Daniel's reflection was interrupted by a soft knock at the door of the office. Sarah entered, her face looking a little more relaxed than it had earlier in the day. "Everything going all right tonight?" Daniel asked, standing up as she walked in. "Yeah, it's been a smooth night," Sarah replied, offering him a small smile. "And I just wanted to say, you've really set the tone here, I can feel it. It's like we're all looking out for each other now." Daniel smiled, grateful for the reassurance. "It's not just me, Sarah. We're all in this together. I can't do it alone, but with the team we have now, I think we're on the right path." "Agreed," Sarah said with a nod. "And I know it's going to take time, but I think everyone's starting to get it. It's just going to take some consistent reminders." Daniel leaned back against his desk, thinking about the long road ahead. The restaurant wasn't just a place of business. It was a community, one that could be a model for how businesses should treat both their employees and their customers. He had always known that the right way forward wasn't about quick fixes. It was about sustaining change in a way that was genuine and lasting. "I'm glad to hear you say that, Sarah," Daniel said thoughtfully. "But it's important to remember that we can't let our guard down. We can't afford to let bad behavior slide, even when it's subtle. We need to keep pushing each other to be better." Sarah smiled, her expression warm. "And we will. You've set the example, Daniel. Now it's up to all of us to carry it forward." As the last of the staff left for the evening, Daniel stood by the front door of Carter's Fine Dining, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. It was a quiet moment, but it was one filled with purpose. He had come a long way since opening this restaurant. There had been moments when he doubted himself, when the weight of running a business felt like too much. But tonight, he felt a quiet sense of confidence and satisfaction. Not because the business was thriving, but because he had learned that true success came from the impact they had on others. The respect they showed one another and the guests they served. It wasn't just about serving good food. It was about serving people in every sense of the word. And with that, Daniel knew they were on the path to something even greater. Together, they would continue to grow, evolve, and make sure that Carter's Fine Dining would be a place where respect and accountability weren't just words. They were the foundation of everything they did. The road ahead was long, but it was the right road, and Daniel was ready for whatever came next. The morning light filtered gently through the large windows of Carter's Fine Dining, casting long shadows over the polished hardwood floors. The restaurant was quiet for the moment, the staff still trickling in for their shifts. But something felt different today. Something had shifted in the air. It wasn't just the usual bustle of opening time. There was a quiet, palpable sense of renewal, a feeling that this day marked a new chapter for everyone involved. Linda sat at the same corner table she had occupied the previous morning, watching as Daniel moved with purpose through the restaurant. His steps were measured, confident. Each movement seemed to carry the weight of everything he had worked for, everything he hoped to build. It had been a long few days since the events that had forced them all to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been lurking beneath the surface. The firing of Melanie had been only the beginning, a catalyst for a much-needed transformation. Daniel had made it clear to his staff that the expectations were changing, that there would be no more tolerance for subtle prejudices, and no more excuses for bad behavior. But now, as the restaurant prepared for another busy day, It was time to see if the words would be followed by actions. As the restaurant's lunch rush began, Daniel walked from the back office into the main dining area, his gaze sweeping over the staff. The changes were starting to feel tangible. Every server greeted guests with a renewed sense of attentiveness and warmth. The cooks in the kitchen worked with a synchronized efficiency, a far cry from the chaotic moments that sometimes defined the earlier shifts. But more than that, the energy of the restaurant felt different. The familiar tension that used to hang over the room was gone. The staff no longer seemed distracted or distant. There was a sense of community in the air, a sense of shared purpose. As Daniel walked past a table where Sarah was talking to a couple, he heard her laughter, a genuine, open sound. For the first time, it wasn't just surface-level politeness. It was something more. It was real connection. Sarah caught his eye and smiled. She had come a long way from the days when she felt like a bystander, unsure of how to handle moments of tension or conflict. Now, she felt empowered. She had been an active part of the cultural shift within the restaurant, and it was clear she had embraced the change with full force. "You're doing great, Sarah," Daniel said, his voice warm as he passed by. "Thanks, Daniel," she replied, her smile widening. "The team's really coming together. It feels good." Daniel's heart swelled with pride. He had always known this moment would come, but seeing it happen before his eyes made it feel more real than he had ever imagined. The work wasn't over yet, but they were well on their way. As the lunchtime crowd continued to arrive, Linda looked on with quiet satisfaction. She knew her son had the capacity to lead, to create something special. But this was more than just a restaurant. It was a space of transformation. And she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come, especially after what had happened with Melanie. The day continued without incident. The service was smooth, the staff worked in harmony, and the customers seemed to appreciate the subtle but unmistakable shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. But Daniel knew this was just one day, a snapshot of what could be if they kept pushing forward. By the time the dinner shift began, Daniel had gathered the staff for a quick debriefing. The mood was different from the usual pre-shift meetings. There was an air of unity among them, a shared understanding that they were not just working toward the success of the business. They were working toward something bigger, something that transcended the role they played in the restaurant. "I want to thank everyone for your hard work today," Daniel began, addressing the group. "I've seen the difference in how we're working together, and I couldn't be prouder of each of you. But there's still a lot of work left to do. We've taken the first step, and now we need to keep building on this. We need to stay accountable to one another and to our values. Every day." He paused, looking around the room, meeting the eyes of each staff member. "This restaurant is more than just a place to work. It's a place where we can create something meaningful together, and we've just started that journey." Daniel's words hit harder than any of the previous speeches he had made. This wasn't about profit margins, ratings, or reviews. It was about values. Sarah stepped forward, nodding in agreement. "The energy's been different all day. There's been a shift in how we interact with each other and with the guests. It feels like we're all a team now, not just a bunch of people doing our jobs. It's something I haven't felt here before." "That's the goal," Daniel replied, his tone sincere. "But we can't let up. Accountability is going to be our cornerstone. It's going to mean holding each other to the highest standards even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's hard." One of the newer staff members, Jessica, spoke up, her voice shy but firm. "I've been here for a few months now, and I can already see the difference. It's not just about following rules. It's about being aware of how we make others feel, of how we treat everyone who walks through those doors." Daniel smiled. "Exactly. We're all responsible for the culture we create, and that's something we have to take seriously. We don't just serve food. We serve people, and that means treating everyone with respect, no matter who they are." After the meeting, Linda took a moment to reflect on the day's events. She had watched the staff work together with an enthusiasm and attentiveness she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just about improving the quality of service. It was about raising the bar for human connection, treating people as equals, no matter their background. Linda thought back to her own experiences in the past, times when she had been treated unfairly, whether overtly or subtly. It was all too familiar, but now she saw how different things could be when people chose to stand up for what was right. Carter's had become a space where, instead of accepting poor treatment or prejudice as inevitable, people were actively challenging it. Linda glanced over at Daniel, who was deep in conversation with Sarah. He was discussing the upcoming changes for the next month's menu and the potential for expanding the restaurant's offerings. But as she watched him, she knew that it wasn't just about food for him anymore. It was about making sure that Carter's fine dining wasn't just a business. It was a place where people could feel welcome and respected. And Daniel had worked hard to build that foundation, but now he was creating a space where everyone else in the restaurant could participate in it too. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, of course. Linda knew that the changes they were striving for wouldn't happen overnight. There would be moments of tension, moments when it would be tempting to fall back into old habits. But those moments were the ones that mattered the most. They were the opportunities to reaffirm their commitment to the values they had set out to uphold. Daniel's commitment to creating a safe, respectful environment would be tested again and again. There would be difficult conversations, uncomfortable truths, and moments where things didn't go as planned. But what mattered was how they responded to those moments. Would they slide back into complacency, or would they rise to the occasion? Linda had faith that they would rise. She had always known that Daniel had a strong sense of what was right, but now she saw that he was committed to making sure everyone else understood what that meant. This wasn't just about making Carter's a successful business. It was about making it a beacon for what a restaurant and a community could be when its leaders and employees chose to live with integrity. As the last guests filed out of Carter's for the night, Linda and Daniel stood together by the door, watching as the city's lights twinkled in the distance. The restaurant was quieter now, but it felt fuller than it had in a long time. There was a sense of fulfillment in the air, as though they had crossed a threshold. "This feels different," Linda said softly, glancing at her son. "I've watched you grow and build this place from the beginning, but now I see something even bigger happening. This isn't just about success in the traditional sense. It's about creating a space where people feel seen, heard, and valued." Daniel nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "It's more than I could have imagined, Mom, and it's just the beginning. I don't have all the answers, but I know we're on the right path." As they stood together in the quiet aftermath of a long day, Linda knew that they were entering a new phase for Carter's fine dining, a phase where success wasn't just measured by the bottom line, but by the impact they made on the lives of everyone who came through the door. This was a new beginning, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like a promising one.